interesting chart. You know, I sit at home sometimes and I look at these charts and I smile and I think, what a beautiful story this chart tells. I hope you share my enthusiasm. So these are all the OECD countries, starting with France and Finland and Belgium and blah, 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 blah. And this is showing how much the OECD governments, what percentage of the gross domestic products of the overall economy is being spent on public social expenditures, housing, welfare, you know, the family benefits, unemployment insurance, or employment insurance, as we call it now. And where's Canada? We're almost at the bottom of the league because Canada made some choices that other countries didn't make, other OECD countries didn't make. The narrative from many politicians over the last 15 to 20 years is there is no choice. We have to cut, we can't afford social programs. Well, that's not what they've said in all these other OECD countries. We're in fact spending less than the United States. And I have to say to you that having earlier said that as a Canadian, you know, we don't like to beat our chests and so on, but the one thing I do like to do is feel smug and superior to the Americans. And I always like thinking, well, you know, okay, things are bad here, but at least we're better than the Americans. Well, we're actually worse than the Americans when it comes to social spending. And that's a pretty stunning thing, because if there's one thing that we think of as Canadians is we're not perfect, you know, our weather sometimes really sucks, but we've got a national health care system and they don't, and, you know, we try and take care of people with a public safety net. But that's not true anymore. It's stunning how quickly this has all changed because of political choices. And because of those choices that have been made, there are real consequences. So homelessness and the affordable housing crisis didn't arise because all of a sudden in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of Canadians said, geez, I'd really like to live mortgage-free. I think it'd be great to live in a park, you know, because gosh, you know, all the fresh air and the sunshine, and you get to hear the birds in the morning. That's not what happened with homelessness. It happened because governments made decisions about cutting housing and income programs. A few years ago, at the Wellesley Institute, we put out a report called State of the Housing and State of Housing in Canada. And we were sitting around one day trying to figure out what image can we use to try and explain the complexity of the housing and homelessness issue, that it's not just about the stereotypical elderly alcoholic on a park bench in a downtown urban area in Vancouver, Montreal, here in Edmonton, downtown Toronto, whatever. That's part of the homelessness issue, but that's only a small part of it. And we, of course, came up with the brilliant idea of the iceberg. You know, stole it from the Titanic or whatever. And of course, the thing about the iceberg, if you haven't ever been a captain of a major ship sailing through the North Atlantic, is that the top part of the iceberg is fairly important. You want to avoid that, but you really want to avoid the stuff that's below water, that's visible. And I want to stop for a second and say that I'm very proud of my children. And I remember 3 or 4 years ago, when we came up with this image, and we thought this is such a beautiful, perfect image to represent the complexity of the housing issue. And my son said to me that with global climate change and all that sort of stuff, that we're going to have to come up with a new image in 10 to 15 years. So anyway, hopefully we won't. But what this, of course, illustrates, and the numbers are outdated now, I'll come in a second, but people who are visibly homeless, the people who are in shelters on the streets, represent the smallest portion of people who are suffering from homelessness and housing. That on average, for every person who's on the street, there are 3 people who are part of the hidden homeless category. There are people living in substandard housing. At the time we did the report, 1.3 million households in Canada, roughly 1 in 10 households. And by substandard housing, I don't just mean that they, you know, the color on their walls wasn't very nice. I mean, it was not fit for human habitation. There was something, they didn't have heat, they didn't have windows, and I'm not also talking about just the housing on First Nations reserves, although that is a shame and an indictment, and that has to be, of course, part of our conversation, but also in our urban areas, housing. In fact, you probably didn't notice it because there's a whole bunch of things, but one of the reports in the last couple of weeks out of Saskatoon was that a motel where they're putting a lot of homeless families, has actually been condemned by the public health authorities, and people were getting sick. And I understand that's also an issue here in Edmonton. So, and then when you start getting into other dimensions of housing need, and then most strikingly in terms of unaffordability, which is the single biggest dimension of the overall housing, complex housing issue, the 3.1 million households are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. Now, like any statistical measure, an average measure conceals all sorts of things, because if you've got an annual income of $10 million and you're spending 30% of that on housing, then you probably are still okay, because you can probably still go to the grocery store and get some milk from time to time or whatever. So, you know, we know that these are inexact measures, but we know that 3.1 households, about 1 in 4 households in Canada, are suffering that. And those are the factors that are driving homelessness. And part of the complex reality, if we don't address all of those. So more recently, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, of which I sit on the board, and the Canadian Homelessness Research Network, which I also sit on the board, put out a report last year called State of Homelessness in Canada. And the estimate then was 35,000 Canadians are homeless every night in Canada. And that's a number that is just really not one that you want to actually say is statistically or scientifically valid, but it's the best estimate that we have. And I actually want to tell you a little story about homelessness in Canada and how interesting these things can be. Back almost 15 years ago, there was a bad earthquake in a suburb of Istanbul, quite a populated suburb. The houses were all flattened and many people were left homeless. And the Turkish government asked the Canadian government to send a team of technical experts to help rebuild the community. And that team included people who had useful skills like architects and builders and stuff. And somebody in the Turkish government thought we should have somebody with some community development skills, so I was actually invited to go along as well. And I was the one guy who actually, I don't know how to wire stuff, I don't know about plumbing, I don't know anything about the technical details of housing, but I do know a little bit about working with people. So I was invited to go there, and as part of, when you're part of an official Canadian delegation to a country, the protocol is, the first thing you do is you go visit officials in the country and you say, we're from Canada, and you know, happy to be here, and thank you very much, and so on. So I was assigned to meet with the head of housing for the Metropolitan Municipality of Istanbul. Istanbul at the time was estimated to be about 15 million people, so a huge city, you know, almost half the size of the population of Canada. And this is a really important guy, and he had a huge office. Remember, he had like 4 cell phones. He gave me a box of Camels, or a carton of Camel cigarettes as a welcome gesture, which I don't smoke, but it was actually useful because I could barter them in the bazaar. But I couldn't speak Turkish, and he couldn't speak English, so I had an interpreter. And I was explaining to him that I'd worked as a community organizer, and there were homeless people. And I could begin to see that between the interpreter and this official, they were starting to have what I thought was an argument. They were going back and forth, and I was just kind of sitting silent. They were just going, like this. I was thinking, what is he translating? Because I'm saying nothing. And then the translator turned to me and said, he doesn't think there's any homeless people in Canada. He doesn't believe you. And this guy pulls out an atlas of Canada. He opens it up and he says, look at all this land you've got. Look at all the trees you've got. You can't possibly have a homeless problem in Canada. And a lot of people think that, and many Canadians also think that. But in fact, we do have a serious homeless problem. Sadly, because of the way this is projected, you can't see this number, but over 235,000 Canadians experience homelessness in a given year. And these are just some of the other numbers. 5,000 people unsheltered, 180,000 people a year in emergency shelters, and so on. So the numbers are absolutely stunning. So what are some of the complex dimensions? Well, we know one of the big issues that's generating homelessness is a severe shortage of affordable and social housing. The private rental and ownership markets are failing to deliver. In most cities in Canada, and I just noticed this here, you don't have a problem yet. It's not that you've forgotten how to build housing, that somehow, you know, we had a kind of cosmic rays destroyed our ability to be able to build housing. We're building lots of housing, and And in some years, we're building almost record amounts of housing. The problem is, it's not housing that is affordable or appropriate for low, moderate, middle-income households. So not only are we not building housing, but we're making cuts to assisted housing programs, and some of the housing that was built in the 50s, 60s, 70s is in urgent need of repair. It is falling apart, not just the social housing, but also private rental housing. A companion issue, of course, to the shortage of housing is low incomes. That the labor market employment earnings are sluggish, which is an economic term which basically means that the economy is not delivering a lot of great jobs these days. And if you track, in fact, go on the Canada Mortgage and Housing website, they very helpfully put graphs on there showing average household incomes and things like average rents for a place like Edmonton. And if you start to track those, what you begin to see is that about 10 to 12 years ago in most major cities in Canada, the incomes began to stagnate and in some cases actually fall, which means people had less money, but the rents and other housing costs kept going up. Income assistance payments don't cover the real cost of housing anywhere in Canada, and they haven't since the cuts of the 1995. In terms of special needs, transitional and supportive housing, that we do know a small portion, it's not the majority of people who are in housing need, but a small portion of people who have housing needs require supports. They may have physical or mental health issues that they're working with, and they need that in order to help access and maintain stable housing, and transitional housing to help people who are homeless move into stability. So we need some of that kind of housing everywhere in the country. The existing housing stock is aging and falling into disrepair. And of course, as we've been reminded this week with the release of the TRC Truth and Reconciliation Report on Tuesday, that for our Indigenous sisters and brothers, that there's an urgent need for culturally appropriate housing, Aboriginal housing under Aboriginal control, on reserve, off reserve, remote, rural, northern, and urban. We used to have a national urban Aboriginal housing strategy that was lost along with the rest of the housing strategies in the early 1990s. So Canada's housing system is complex and dynamic, and that seems to overwhelm some people, but actually, I think we need to turn around and say that's actually quite beautiful. We have, it's kind of like a beautiful watch with all these lovely gears that all work together very nicely, and the housing system is all nicely, if it's working correctly, it's calibrated, but if you take out this piece here and that piece there and so on, then very quickly the housing system begins to fail. And that's what's been happening in Canada in recent years. So in my hometown of Toronto, if any of you have ever visited Toronto, you may vaguely recognize this big building in the background. It's what we in Toronto called Old City Hall, but when this picture was taken in 1911, it was New City Hall. And Toronto back in that time, like a lot of cities in North America, Europe, and around the world, had slums. And these were appalling places. We, for the most part, don't have slums anymore, certainly not to the extent in the urban areas like we had back then. Open sewers, no clean water, no proper heating, no proper place to store food or to cook food, so lots of disease. Children were dying at alarmingly high rates. And one of the big advances of the first 30 to 40 years in Toronto was and across Canada was we eradicated slums, because we said, this is not good. It's not good for the people living in them, it's not good for the city. And these are a couple of the pioneers from Toronto, Dr. Charles Hastings and Dr. Herbert Bruce, both of them incidentally medical doctors, which is interesting. And both of them came to the housing issue not because they felt that housing was the first solution, but they came to it because, in the case of Dr. Bruce, he wanted to try and slow down the infant mortality rate and realized that giving people good health care when they get sick is important, but it's even better they don't get sick in the first place. So he became a big advocate for slum eradication. So we have a history in Toronto of doing wonderful things. And this guy is one of my great Canadian heroes. And I get to speak a lot. Because you didn't get the full bio when you were introduced, you didn't hear some of my sordid past, but I did attend law school. Don't worry, I don't practice as a lawyer, so don't hold that against me. But I often speak to law students and give them a history of housing in Canada, and I always ask if anybody recognizes who this person is. Does anyone here recognize? No? So this is John Peters Humphreys. Now John grew up in the 1920s, 1930s in Montreal. He had polio as a child, and his arm was slightly, if you saw his full thing, his arm is slightly misshapen. And he was teased a lot as a boy. And some people think that that's one of the things that led to his consciousness about how we treat each other. He also, while working as a law professor at McGill University in the 1930s, was one of the first to start sounding the alarm about the mass execution of Jewish people, of gays and lesbians, communists, gypsies, and all the others that were being systematically killed by the Nazis. And John had this amazing opportunity. So in 1994, the wife of the US President, so US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was actually just about to pass away, but his wife was the chair of a conference in San Francisco to establish the United Nations. And this was a tremendous moment in human history. You know, sometimes we have these great moments when you can actually say, my God, I'm proud to be a human being. A lot of the time you can't say that, but you can say that about San Francisco. If you've ever been to San Francisco and been to the site of the UN conference, the founding conference in 1944, it is actually really inspiring. And what the people said back then, the leaders that gathered, was they looked at the horrible things that were happening in Germany. They looked at the horrible carnage of the war, the huge numbers, the millions upon millions of civilians who had died because of the notion of war in the First and Second World War, which was to attack the civilian populations and not just combatants. And they said there's got to be a better way for us to build a new world, and that killing each other is actually not a very good way to do it. And so they decided to create the United Nations, and they decided to say, look, you know, it's probably going to be a lot of talking and stuff, but at least it's better to talk than it is to kill. And they said the United Nations has to be founded on a fundamental value. And that value has to be a respect for individuals. And each individual is worthy of respect, not because they're nice people, or because they got money, or because they got white skin, or black skin, or they're bald, or whatever, you know, they wear green jackets. Not because of any, but because we're humans, and as humans we share one quality, which is we're humans. And some of you, and my sister Anglican here, will know that there's echoes of some of the faith traditions. This notion of the inherent dignity of humans is something that's very common in many faith traditions. So John Peters Humphreys was summoned by Mrs. Roosevelt to San Francisco to write the first draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's quite an amusing story, and I'm probably telling way too many stories, but I'll just simply say this because I find it amusing as a law student. You know, lawyers and law professors call things their briefs, which are hundreds of pages long. So the first version of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that he produced was about 300 or 400 pages long. And it was the kind of thing you'd expect a law professor to do. It was, you have the right to this, and then it would have all sorts of subclauses, and then subclauses, and footnotes, and academic references, and so on. It was a brilliant piece of work. Mrs. Roosevelt looked at it and said, this is great. You've actually captured everything in here that we need, except it's got to be on one page, and you've got to use simple language, because nobody's going to get it. And so she sent it back, and he produced, along with the editorial team, what we now call the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And for the first time, things like the right to housing, the right to income, the right to be free from discrimination, the right to equality, and the right to free speech, and so on, was recognized at the international level. And one thing I want to say is very important about human rights is that human rights don't depend on governments to say, well, I'm going to give you this right. So we don't have to wait for Parliament to pass a law saying you have the right to housing. You have the right to housing. What the Universal Declaration says is the responsibility of governments to realize that right. And so how do governments realize the right to housing? Well, in some places you have private markets that deliver housing, and where the private markets fail, then you have social housing, and you have other mechanisms. You regulate the private market with rent controls and rent regulations in order to prevent sharp practices by landlords and so on. But the Universal Declaration is based on that profound notion. And earlier today, when I was out at the Homeless Memorial, along with many of you, that's exactly what the Homeless Memorial is about. It's recognizing that people have dignity and worth, not because they've led great lives, or they have lots of money, or they have fame or fortune, or they married well, or they can do whatever skills, but because they're humans. And the rights-based approach is a very, very powerful approach. And I just love John Peters Humphreys. I want to tell you a story about him. So he went on to become the head of the United Nations Human Rights Department, which grew into the Human Rights Council, which is now the senior human rights body in the UN. It's a very powerful and important organization, and one that I spent a lot of time working with. When he was retiring in the 1950s, there was a big ceremony to give an award. The United Nations has an award, which I think is actually called the United Nations Prize, but I can't remember exactly what it's called anyway, given by the Secretary General for a very distinguished service, very, very eminent award. And they ended up giving the award to a French lawyer who was the assistant to Mr. Humphreys, Professor Humphreys. And he was such a good Canadian, he didn't sort of say, wait a minute, you screwed up, you know, that's supposed to be me. He just said, well, okay, you know, I'm not going to make a fuss. And it was actually discovered later, the mistake, and it wasn't Mr. Humphreys who brought it to people's attention, and he was subsequently awarded the correct prize. But he was a visionary who said, you know, we have to take this fundamental notion, this value, which sounds so abstract that everybody has dignity, and we've got to turn it into something that we can actually build programs and practices around and actually realize. So he was a very, very important Canadian. And his work echoes down in a lot of Canadian history. In 1973, when the National Housing Act was amended to bring in our National Housing Program, the one that I said for 20 years generated 600,000 affordable homes in every part of Canada, this is what the Minister of Housing, the Honourable Ron Basford, said. Good housing at a reasonable cost is a social right of every citizen of this country. This must be our objective, and it was the government's objective, obligation, and their goal. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Think of any sort of random federal politician you could think of, including several from this province of Alberta, and imagine them saying that. You know, it's kind of it sounds radical now, but it was the notion. The notion was, look, the government has a role to play. The government is not supposed to crowd the private sector out. It's not going to replace the private sector in terms of delivery of housing, but it's going to pick up where the private sector is unable to deliver and ensure that every Canadian realizes their right to housing. Now, the National Housing Program from 73-93 was not perfect. Some of you may have developed housing under that program. I did. It was frustrating at times and not perfect, but it was based on a vision and a concrete set of practices. So we live in a society where if you have somebody in a white lab coat say something, then we tend to believe it's true because we think scientists are the gods of our society, except for there are some people who don't think that. But anyway, in 1999, a group of us housing advocates gathered in Toronto, and we looked that previous winter. There had been a bad ice storm, which you may remember in Quebec and eastern Canada. Hundreds of thousands, millions of homes lost their electricity. People were forced into homelessness because of this ice storm. And it was amazing what the government did. The government did two very important things. First of all, they brought in emergency relief. They opened up schools. They brought in power generators. They even had machines printing checks. This is before our cashless society. So they were printing checks and handing people checks so they could go out and buy stuff, like buy more clothing or whatever they needed to keep them going during that period of crisis while they were forced out of their homes. And then they put money into rebuilding the housing. And we thought, you know, if governments can respond that way to a natural disaster, why can't they respond that way to the homelessness crisis, which by the late 1990s was sweeping across the country? So we convened a group of people, and the mayor of Toronto at the time was a guy named Mel Lastman. And the big city mayors of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who are actually meeting this weekend, today and tomorrow, along with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities here in Edmonton. But back in that day, they used to get together whenever the Grey Cup was held, and they'd get together whenever Sydney Grey Cup was being held. I think that year was in, I'm not a sports fan, so maybe Vancouver. Anyway, so Mayor Lastman, Mayor of Edmonton, the Mayor of Winnipeg, all the big city mayors would get together and they'd drink some beers and bet on the game and do whatever men do when they watch football, which I don't know because that's not part of my cultural tradition. So we said, let's be subversive, let's infiltrate that meeting of mayors, and let's have Mayor Lastman say to his fellow mayors, listen, you know, after the second or third beer, when they're kind of a little bit lubricated, why don't we as mayors all get together and say homelessness is a national disaster, just like the ice storm, and get the federal government to invoke emergency disaster relief legislation. We thought it was a brilliant plan. We also assumed that we would get laughed out of the room. But in fact, Mayor Lastman and another Toronto politician, a guy named Jack Layton, that you may have heard about, one of the greatest Canadians, if I may say so, convinced the other mayors to do this. And it didn't even actually take 2 beers to do it. They did it before they started. And so we held a meeting in Toronto of advocates and mayors and others from all across the country. And we invited Ursula Franklin, who, this is an early picture of her, but she's a distinguished academic from the University of Toronto, a physicist or something, I don't know. She's got some sort of machine there. Anyway, Dr. Franklin came out and she said, homelessness is a man-made disaster. And everyone in the room roared. You know, there was hundreds of people there from all across the country roaring, cheering, and all that sort of stuff. And afterwards, because I am a fairly sensitive, you know, in those days, 20th century male, now 21st century male, I said, you know, Dr. Franklin, brilliant what you said, but we don't try to be gender specific. We try not to sort of, you know, blame women or men for stuff, you know. So maybe we should just sort of like it's a human disaster. Dr. Franklin turned to me and said, who's the Prime Minister of Canada? And I said, well, it's a man. And who's the Premier of Ontario? Well, man. And we went through the whole list. It is a man-made disaster. So Dr. Franklin felt that it was appropriate to do it. But, you know, the encouraging thing about calling homelessness a man-made disaster is that if men, and maybe an occasional woman or two, but if people created this problem, then we can actually uncreate the problem. We can remake the problem. And what we have to start doing is understanding that this is not a force, a cosmic force of nature that has come beyond us. Now, I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about things that just earlier this week, Tuesday morning, I was in front of the all-party parliamentary caucus on poverty, and as the name suggests, it's all the political parties that are there, and actually I suppose senators and at least the ones that haven't yet been put in jail. And the sorry, that was a very cheap shot. Please erase that for the records. It's so beneath me. And members of Parliament, and they always squirm at when you start talking about money, because you can't throw money at the homelessness. Money is not going to solve the problem. It's too difficult. And I said, well, actually, you know, money. You can't solve homelessness with money. So I love this image of the house made out of money. Sadly, I think it'll take more than a few $20 bills. But it is absolutely true that this man-made disaster can be unmade. So what has the government been doing? I'm going to talk about the federal government. So over the past 25 years, Canada's population has grown by 30%. But our annual national investment in affordable housing and social housing has decreased by 46%. Population up, investment down. So is it any surprise that we have mass homelessness in urban areas and rural areas? And Is it any surprise that advocates say, look, we have to actually throw some money? Federal spending on low-income housing per capita has dropped over this 25-year period from $115 per person to $60 per person. So it's basically cut in half. So again, homelessness is a man-made disaster, and we can unmake this disaster. These are all numbers from the State of the Homelessness report of Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, Canadian Homeless Research Network. Google it and you'll find it.